Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Bob Ingram. I'm a financial planner here at the Center for Financial Planning. And as a comprehensive planning firm, we understand that funding a college education still remains one of the most significant financial goals for families, really parents and grandparents alike. And it's not just a major investment, it's a deeply personal one with a lot of commitment to leaving that legacy of education for one's family. And really today, the landscape of college admissions, financial aid continues to be more complex than ever, from identifying the right school fit to understanding, how aid is awarded and developing a long-term saving strategy. Effective college planning involves many moving parts. So our goal for this session is to really equip you with some strategies to help you and your family make informed decisions so you can find the best educational fit and make a financially sound investment in your students' future. Before we get started, just a couple quick housekeeping notes that in the interest of keeping within our time tonight, we won't be able to take questions, but if you do have questions, and I'm sure there'll be several, please feel free to reach out to us. You can reach out to your individual planner. If you're a client of the center, you'll be able to reach out to me personally. We'll have means of connecting with myself and with others here within our center team. Go ahead and get started. So the Center for Financial Planning, for those that may be new to the center, we are a privately held wealth management firm founded in 1985. We're really excited to be celebrating our 40th anniversary of a firm this year in 2025. And our mission is that we are striving to improve lives through financial planning done right. We have our main office, of course, here in Southfield, as well as an office out in Brighton. We have 31 team members, and we're really excited and proud to share that we have over 15 members of our team. So almost half our team has the Certified Financial Planner designation. And we serve clients across 40 different states in the US. So really widespread firm, really excited for that. And again, with a goal and mission of improving lives through financial planning done right. Again, my name is Bob Ingram. I am a certified financial planner professional. I've been with the center since 2017 and been in the industry as a financial planner for just over 20 years now. And in addition to specializing in retirement income, wealth planning, I really enjoy helping families provide education, plan for college, plan to fund college, for their, again, kids, grandkids. And as I mentioned before, paying for college is one of the most significant goals that clients will have in a financial plan. In fact, for many families, it's often the second largest purchase that they'll make, next to their home. It's that significant. And of course, as we know, costs of college, the rising costs of college over the years and decades has been a trend that we're still continuing to see. So we really do think it has many different parts. And it's important goal that really does require some planning over the years. And we'll talk about that both in terms of, kind of gearing up for the college search, but even longer term planning and how you can position your finances for that particular goal. So to start out, let's talk about the goal of funding college. And we know the rising costs of college. It's something that we've been dealing with, and we know it's something that is facing, parents and grandparents and students, of course, as they plan for their own education. So start with a quiz. As a percentage, how much has tuition increased nationally at public institutions? As an example, public state universities, for example, since 2005, so the last 20 years. Yeah, 67%? Is it 85%, 110%, or 133%? What do you think? How much has tuition actually increased in the last 20 years? Well, interestingly enough, it's actually 133%. For public universities, four-year in-state, the last 20 years, it's more than doubled. And if you can sort of see the graph here, even for both public and private schools, there's been a few years, particularly around the pandemic years, where it was slowing, the rate of change and the rate of increase was a little bit slower, but still more than double, and 133% for public. Private universities and colleges is actually 126% in that same time frame. Interestingly, slightly less than public universities going back to 2005. Now, if we go back 30 years, so go back to the 90s, since 1990, that percentage in 35 years is actually over 213% for public and 415% for private schools. So if you go back 35 years, the trend for private colleges and universities is certainly much higher, and the rate of inflation is much more. And looking at that, 400% over 35 years, where normal inflation is about 3%, that would be closer to an average annual increase, going back to 1990, of almost 5%. And in the last 20 years, it's been closer to 4%. At 133%, let's say for public schools. So we know that we've got a plan for rising costs more than the rate of inflation. So when we're talking about goals, big part of goal setting, whether it's college, retirement, or other goals in good financial planning, we want to make sure we have a target of what are the costs we need to be planning for now and what those costs could look like in the future. So some examples of universities and colleges, and it's kind of a mix of both private and public universities, can range clearly by some of these numbers. And when you look at this, it's a double take. This is not fiction. Northwestern University and Columbia University, over $90,000 all in, kind of the sticker price, if you will. Johns Hopkins, even University of Denver, in the 80,000 range. And then some of the state universities, University of California, Berkeley, here in Michigan, University of Michigan, Michigan State, in the 30,000 range. And then University of Texas at Austin, slightly less than 30,000 at just over 26,500. So quite a range and difference in terms of the costs of colleges, depending on the type, location, and again, public versus private. So step one, having a good understanding of the potential costs today. And then if we go back and apply the trend, if we see a trend continue into the future of those rising college costs, we have to expect that those costs could continue to rise, again, above the rate of inflation. So when we start thinking about goal setting and what you may need to plan for, if you were to plan for full cost for 4 years of college, you can clearly see the investment could be in the several hundreds of thousands of dollars in the future. So not everybody, of course, pays these, kind of the full rate, sticker price, but we'll talk about some of the ways that does change. But some other costs that are important, some other things that could influence the amount of total college costs of an education. So here's another quiz for you. What percentage of students transfer at least once over the course of their undergrad education? 6%, 15%, 25%, or 37%? At some point, on average, students, what percentage of the students start school actually end up transferring at least one time? And this number also is very surprising. 37%. So more than a third of students at some point in time are likely to transfer. And what can that mean? Well, the average cost, if you look at research, average cost of a transfer can be as much as $14,000. And just under double that if there's a transfer twice. 2 transfers can be as much as $24,000. Now, why is that? Certainly, there's some great reasons to potentially transfer, but some of the considerations and reasons for those extra costs are when a student transfers, not all credits transfer in the same way. So there may be some repeating credits or needing to take additional classes to get those credits earned at the first school after that transfer. Sometimes certain classes are provided and allowed for being electives, but not necessarily counted toward core required classes. So there's sometimes students will have to retake or take additional classes again that are required, for a particular program or a major or a course of study, depending on the college and university. Also, things like location and travel, cost of living. There could be an increase in the on-campus or off-campus living from one school to the next. That could be an extra cost than what was originally planned for at the first school. And of course, then there's the other non-financial, like the social costs, possibly starting a little bit later, maybe in the workforce, or for the next opportunity if there's grad school or future study. Those things could be delayed. Of course, those are other costs. But the point being, there's some additional financial costs that you just need to take into consideration. So part of a good, smart college process or planning process, ideally, it's not perfect, but ideally, if we can start by having a good college search and finding a good fit for students, that's usually a great start to try to maybe minimize the potential for kind of the start and stop or transferring from one school to the next. But again, there can be some great reasons to transfer, better opportunity, finding the right fit after maybe the first year or two at one school. And at the end of college, it could have been the greatest decision. But it's important to at least have those considerations. But finding a good fit can be a key to try to minimize that. So some things to consider for finding a good, really keys to successful college search. Certainly academic fit. Course of study. What is the school offering in terms of the academic programs, the majors that the student is going to pursue? Is there a fit in terms of teaching style, support services, class sizes? Are those the right fit and can lead to the right success in finding the right school? The career aspirations. What career path is the student considering? Or is there some uncertainty there? But trying to find that right fit that positions things well. It could be a network, individuals, a school that places students successfully in different careers or industries can make a big difference to get a good jump start. Where the location is. Where is the student staying very locally, close to home, same state, or different parts of the country? As we saw in the sample of different schools across the country, there's obviously different costs regionally, cost of living changes, all those factor in. The social and cultural fit. So what is the campus size? What's the environment like? What's the dynamic of the students? Some of the demographic considerations for the student body. All of those are important. And then, of course, trying to find a fit and position your student for acceptance. Now, acceptance rates are something to understand and take into account, but you don't want to overemphasize that. Statistics and acceptance rates, and when we talk to college prep resources and other research, a lot of statistics can be a little misleading. Schools are certainly in the business of trying to show themselves as being exclusive and try to create demand. But finding those fits where your student would fit in well and potentially stand out, that can make a difference not only for admissions, but as we'll talk about in some of the financial aid, potentially merit scholarship opportunities and such. Of course, financial considerations, the overall cost of the school, what's affordable, what's the plan for paying for school and coming out of that college experience without too much debt and have the opportunity to start one's career path well. So we think of it in terms of long-term value, and not everything is financial, but think of return on investment. What is the overall college experience likely to provide for the student? Both from academics, career opportunities, social connection, lifestyle, all of that should fit together. But trying to find, and there's a lot there, so it's not easy. So when should you start? Well, as soon as it makes sense. Start thinking about what are the important criteria, that your students thinking of, in the high school years. And some students have an idea of what they'd like to do even before high school. And you can start to narrow this in start that research process. But particularly going into, let's say, junior and senior year, really start to narrow in those priorities that can make the most difference. So as we talk about costs, we have a good fit. Let's say you've gone through, what does it mean to fit in some of the costs, financial aspects, and paying for school? So we know that financial aid has different types and different priorities, for folks. So first, there's need-based financial aid, grants, scholarships based on one's ability to pay for the costs of a particular school, college, university. There's also merit-based aid. So merit scholarships earned based on academic achievements, special talents, sports, etc. And then finally, of course, there's loans. So borrowing and having access to different kinds of loans and borrowing that could be slightly more advantaged than others, part of that financial aid combination. And we'll talk about these in a little more detail each. So financial aid process, because this can be, very overwhelming. But essentially, there are two basic aid forms and types. There's the free application for federal student aid. That's the most common, the one most everybody knows very well. In the acronym FAFSA, free application for federal student aid, you hear that a lot. What that is for primarily, it's the process in the application that, number one, determines federal financial aid programs, whether it's Pell Grants, federal student loans, work-study support, etc. The other is the college scholarship service profile, and that is used more specifically for some private schools and some public universities. So it's separate, and really it depends on this particular school if that college or university just uses the FAFSA, or they specifically use the FAFSA and potentially the CSS, college scholarship service profile. In some cases, colleges just will use the CSS. But we'll focus mostly on the FAFSA because it's the most common and it has the most application. So I said, in addition to federal student aid programs, one of the questions often that comes up is, well, I don't think based on our family's income, our asset levels, we're going to get much need-based financial aid. Does it still make sense to go through the process in completing the FAFSA and also the CSS? And the answer is yes. In most cases, it is. Why is that? Because state financial aid programs use the FAFSA. In addition to that, many institutions, so colleges and universities themselves, often will use the FAFSA, even if it's to determine merit aid. So having a FAFSA on file, having that application there is important. It's still a key to determining the ability to apply for different things and also have the schools come to the table with potential merit offerings. So it's still important to complete that. Student aid index. So how is the FAFSA actually used? You go through the application, you fill out the information. There's a formula that helps determine the amount of need-based aid or aid in general. And that's the student aid index. It used to be the expected family contribution, the EFC, but it's a different index measure for the ability or how much can be paid for school for every family. Now, the CSS profile, well, it uses a different methodology. It actually uses its own formula. It's similar to try to figure out institutional aid based on need and others, but it adds a little bit more detail. We'll talk about some of the recent changes to the FAFSA. The CSS profile is a little bit more encompassing as far as what assets it will include from owned by the family in certain incomes. So in some ways, it can be a little bit more detailed, and it can have more assets that count towards what the colleges would say are assets available to be used for college. Whereas the FAFSA, it has more exclusions. It excludes more assets and things in that formula. So it's important to look at the differences as you go through those based on the types of schools that you may be applying to or your students applying to. So how are these used? So let's focus on the FAFSA because, again, it is the most common. Essentially, there's an assessment based on assets and income. And this is one of the kind of the common misconceptions is, well, assets. I have too much assets. I have retirement accounts. I've accumulated some great savings over working years. But you know what? My son or daughter probably isn't going to get aid because of what I've accumulated. Well, interestingly enough, you can see here that the formula for the student aid index uses different percentages, a combination of percentages of parent income, parent assets, the student's income and the student's assets in combination to figure out what is available to be used to cover college costs. And you can see here that the income, both for the parents and the students, frankly, are more significant. So income plays a larger role than assets. It ranges based on certain income levels. So for example, parents typically, they'll count up to 47% of income can make a difference in terms of what they say is available to use for college. Whereas the assets are a much smaller percentage, 5.64 is the maximum. So in theory, parents can have more assets and it does not hurt them, quote unquote, in the financial aid formula. Now compare that to students, still lower than income. So students up to 20% of assets is a determining percentage, but it's still less than the income, 50% of the income for students. So certainly parents can have more assets and potentially more income compared to students. So oftentimes that comes into a financial planning discussion. Well, where should we have our savings, saving for college? Should we have it in the student's name or the parent's name? So this really just shows it still makes sense that parent-owned assets, the income of the parents, is more advantageous than having more assets and more income that the student is claiming. And we'll talk more about what that looks like in some of the saving strategies in a few minutes. Now, the other would be grandparents or non-parents. And this is interesting. This gets back to a couple of the changes that have happened recently with the FAFSA. Grandparent, non-parent assets are not factored in. Same with income or contributions. So if grandparents have college savings accounts, those college savings accounts will not be counted on the FAFSA. So what does that do? There's some strategies and some gifting that could come into play there where it doesn't hurt one's chances for financial aid. So what are some of the changes? It's kind of how the FAFSA works and how it's used, but let's talk about some of the changes. So within the last couple of years, FAFSA simplification has really cut down the number of questions on the application, literally in half. Good thing, right? Makes it a little easier to get through. At the same time, there were some additional changes that were made as part of that process that we're now seeing as we go through the current year and then into the following school year next year. And that is the divorce formula changed. So instead of the primary residence of the student, the parent with the primary residence, now it's the parent with the primary financial support whose information is weighted. There's also no discount for the number of students in college at the same time. It used to be for a family that has let's say two kids or three kids, and there's overlap the number of years in college. If you had more kids going to school at the same time and your financial circumstances are the same, that helped the need-based aid. Well, that discount went away. There's no real extra benefit by having multiple kids at the same time. So unfortunately, that's a negative that kind of hurts financial aid eligibility, or at least it doesn't reduce the amount of, that the colleges expect and the federal government programs expect families to contribute. because they have two kids or more in school at the same time. Small business definition updated, certain things, certain farm business assets, and those were having to be included, whereas they weren't before. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the grandparent contributions are no longer a negative impact. So in particular, we'll talk about college savings plans as a saving strategy in a few minutes, but that's one great implication, is that it used to be if distributions from a 529 or a college savings plan that we say grandparent, it's non-parent owned. So, grandma and grandpa have a 529 plan, for example, and they are going to make a distribution to pay for a semester worth of school. It used to be the student had to claim that income coming from the grandparent 529 plan. So if that happened early in the school, the 4 years of school, that could be picked up for a future year in the financial aid. Well, the good news is that's no longer the case. It's no longer reported as income. So that doesn't go on that student income calculated in the formula for the student aid index. So that's a good thing and a positive thing, and it could lead to more flexible strategies where family gifting or family non-parents have college savings plans for grandkids or nieces and nephews, other relatives, etc. So in terms of need-based aid, that's kind of the basics. Let's talk a little bit about non-need-based aid or merit. So scholarships, trying to find, the unicorn. What are those scholarships that your student, is really right for? Well, the biggest and largest and most impactful source of scholarship money still comes from the colleges and universities themselves. So finding that right college fit, targeting the schools appropriately, finding the ability where your student stands out, maybe for a particular program, for a certain academic path at particular schools, that can increase the chances of having some kind of merit-based aid or merit scholarship money, that college acceptance. Other local scholarships, in the community can be a source. Smaller impact, typically smaller dollars, but every little dollar helps. And then other private organizational scholarships can be a way to do that. But the days of trying to search the internet and just finding a great scholarship opportunity, the value may not be as great as really trying to focus at the top, the biggest impact being the individual searching and the individual schools. So what are some of the ways that students can stand out? And there are literally, from some of the sources and research we've done and some partners and some other companies that we've worked with, different interests, certain demonstrated interests can literally turn into dollars. Sometimes being out of state for certain schools can mean additional attractiveness, depending on the college or universities. Grades, certainly those transcripts, every A can add to literally dollars per grade. The amount of classes, AP classes, higher end, top level classes within high school, let alone the potential for credits in college, those can translate into actual dollars saved in school. Letters of recommendation that are meaningful. Again, find where those schools are that really value those personal parts of the college application. Testing is still important, still a critical part of test scores. So whether it's ACT, SAT scores are key. Certainly the FAFSA and having those dollars that can be meaningful in the CSFS profile as well. Interesting things about the financial aid process and having that FAFSA or the CSS on file. I mentioned that schools will use the information, even if it's just to make sure that it's on file to evaluate for types of merit awards. In some ways, some schools are looking for the ability, not just people that might need aid, but they're looking for those who might not qualify for need-based aid, but they're going to be able to pay full rate. It's a little bit kind of negative the way to think of it that way, but it can be an advantage in some ways to actually have a FAFSA and show that you don't need financial aid for some college acceptances. Again, essays can be, a value for, for literally dollars saved. So finding ways to stand out, those activities, those special talents, and matching those right with the school, again, can be part of finding ways to have other non-need-based aid as we go through. So let's take a quick break again here and take another little quick quiz. So as we talked about the different paths, which path would be the least expensive? Choosing a 4-year public college? How about starting at a 2-year school, associate's degree, and then transferring to any other kind of 4-year college or university? What about starting at a public college, but then transferring over to a private college? Or starting and finishing at a 4-year private university? What do you think is the least expensive? Well, a bit of a trick question. All of the above could be true. So much depends on, of course, the student, but the particular circumstances and what the school is. Sometimes a transferring, well, we talked about the potential costs, going from, let's say, a 2-year associate's degree and moving to a 4-year college to finish the last 2 years for the undergrad degree, that can sometimes make sense. And any small additional costs can be well worth it. In total, the cost might be a savings. In other cases, going to a private versus a public university, depending on the fit. Oftentimes, even though a private school might have a higher starting ticket price or sticker price, when aid comes in and some of the offerings the school might provide, that a similar state school, even an in-state school, at an in-state cost, if there's more aid provided to the private school or from the private school, that could actually be a little bit of a lower cost than the in-state or out-of-state cost of a public school. So much depends, and that's why the search and the research is so important, given the different circumstances and the path your students are likely to take. So financial aid in terms of financial need, merit, positioning. Let's talk a little bit about loans for just a minute. So really 3 main categories of loans. Federal student loans, again, going through the FAFSA for the potential to have approval for student loans. This is the program. So essentially for students, there's really a couple of different types. They're offered by the Department of Education. Interest rates can vary, and of course, it all depends on the current interest rate environment in general. But as of August, they were 6.4% and 8.94%. So in general range within that. So again, not as low as we saw when rates were very, very low, 2-3 years ago and more. But as you'll see, they still could be more competitive than some other types of loans, such as private loans. And really, there's a couple of different types. There's the direct subsidized loan, which are need-based. If you qualify for need-based, you get it subsidized. What does that mean? Your interest is covered while the student's in school. Interest is not accumulating along the way. And they're, of course, deferred for payments to start after. Now, direct unsubsidized student loans, the interest is accumulating. There's deferral while the students are in school, potentially, but it's not necessarily need-based. So there's a little bit easier time to qualify for the unsubsidized federal student loans versus the subsidized. Now, there are some limitations on the total amounts that can be borrowed each year, but there's some advantages in that, again, flexibility, ease of potentially getting qualified. Students don't necessarily have to have a well-established credit to qualify for the federal student loan programs. There's some asset protection and loan protections in place for federal loans. So there are some good advantages there. Direct plus loans are for the parents, and graduate students. So again, they're a little bit, can be a little larger in terms of amounts to borrow, still have some advantages in terms of the interest rates over other types of loans, but they're separate from the subsidized and unsubsidized loans that the students would take on in their name. There's also state-based loans typically offered by, at the individual state level, usually to residents of that state and often and most often for state schools, and specifically covering those education costs. But typically it's, again, not really well designed for folks that are going outside of their particular home resident state. And then you have private student loans. And these would be loans offered by banks and other financial institutions, other lenders, credit unions, again, to cover specifically education expenses. Average interest rates do vary, and they can vary widely based on credit history. They can range from low single digits to even low double digits in some cases. And again, terms are set by the lender. And some cases may require a co-signer if a student is involved and does have limited credit history, because it is based on credit worthiness. So different offerings for federal student loans. Part of planning is not just to know what kinds of loans, of course, but what is the total amount of debt that you as a parent or a student want to take on? How would you service that debt? What is that going to look like in your overall financial plan over the years, and what does that how does that maybe impact other goals that you're saving for, such as retirement? So having a good plan for understanding the total cost, how much are you planning would be paid for out of pocket? How much could be planned for paid by savings? And then where loans could be used strategically, what's the right fit for your situation to not get overly burdened, and particularly for the students to not take on so much student debt, where at the end of college, they're saddled with tens and tens of thousands of dollars of debt that they may have to carry and pay for a decade. So long-term, if we're thinking savings, let's say you've accumulated some assets in your plan, you've done some great planning, what are some ways that you can pay for college besides, of course, out of pocket, besides loans? Once you've had you figured out your financial aid or the potential for financial aid, you're setting up a long-term savings plan where a lot of these questions of types of schools, whether financial aid is possible, maybe you're not sure. For kids that are going to be students 5, 10, even 15, 18 years from now. So let's look at a few different types of investments and where they might fit into your savings plan. So regular investment accounts, basic taxable brokerage account, investment account, savings account, bank account, where no particular tax advantages per se. Earnings are taxed as they occur. So if you have dividends, if you have interest accumulated, if you have securities and you buy and sell at a gain, you have capital gains, you pay the taxes as you go in the year that they're realized. But it's very flexible. You can use use an investment account for anything, not just for education, but obviously for retirement planning, for saving for a house, a second home, short-term needs, cash reserves. Regular savings and investment accounts are the most flexible, but they don't necessarily offer additional tax advantages. Now, custodial accounts. You set up for a minor, so until it's set up in the name of a custodian owner or a conservator, for the benefit of the beneficiary, let's say student or minor. And it's held until they reach the age of majority, which is either 18 to 21. State of Michigan, it's 18, could differ by different states. And again, it's flexible in terms of what it can be used for. The intent is that it's used for the beneficiary or the student or child, the minor child's benefit. School, college can certainly be one of those reasons and uses for a custodial account. What are some of the downsides? Well, number one, while it's flexible for use, the control of who owns the account, who controls the asset, or who controls the balance of the dollars in the account, it's a gift. It is dollars contributed are no longer owned truly by the person, or let's say the parents or the grandparents that may have funded a custodial account. Once the beneficiary, the minor, reaches that age of majority, let's say here in Michigan, age 18, technically, legally, it's his or her money. It's their money. So the control is lost, and now the child and now a young adult potentially has the ability to take those funds and do what they want. So some parents, grandparents, family, it's not the most advantageous. The other is from an asset position standpoint for financial aid. It's considered a child asset, a child-owned asset. So back in the formula for financial aid and the student aid index, let's say for the FAFSA, it is considered a child asset. So it's a little bit more of an impact in that college need formula than if it was owned by the parents. So not the most advantageous from a financial aid perspective. How about IRA accounts, such as Roth IRAs? IRAs and Roth IRAs can be used for education purposes with some caveats. So let's use a Roth IRA is a great example. Normally a Roth IRA, you contribute after tax dollars. The growth is deferred. And then if used after age 59 and a half, all the earnings and contributions come out fully tax-free, tax exempt. You don't pay taxes on that growth. For college costs and education expenses, you don't have to pay penalties if you withdraw the dollars, particularly the earnings before 59 and a half. There's no early withdrawal penalty. Normally, if you withdraw funds from an IRA or Roth IRA, you pay a 10% penalty plus potential taxes. In this case, there's penalty-free withdrawals. However, the earnings on a Roth IRA normally would be tax-free. If you're under 59 and a half and you use those dollars, you have to claim them as taxable income. So you don't get the tax-free growth when using those earnings for education. But an advantage is Roth IRA accounts. I mentioned that there are some exclusions for financial aid purposes. Certain accounts are excluded from, let's say, parental or student assets. Retirement accounts, 401k plans, 403b plans, IRA, Roth IRAs, for example, are considered retirement accounts, and they're excluded from the list of assets that you'd have to report on the FAFSA. However, withdrawals that add to income would be considered income on the FAFSA. So that's a downside potentially using Roth dollars. And if you're under 59 and a half, if you draw the earnings that become taxable, it's reported as income. Therefore, it's also an income on the tax return and an income reported through the FAFSA for financial aid purposes. There are also, of course, income limitations on the Roth IRAs. If you earn a certain amount of money, you're not able to contribute to Roth IRAs, so it's not usable for a lot of families. And really, it's intended for retirement. When we think of planning for retirement and education goals, we really love to prioritize the Roth as a very powerful asset to own for your retirement years because of that tax-free growth compounding over the years. So it's not the most ideal, but it certainly could be used if needed for education. Then there's the Covered Education Savings Accounts. Formerly, years and years ago, was the Education IRA. Still available, still around, provides tax-deferred growth, similar to the Roth IRA. Withdrawals for qualified expenses are tax-free if used for expenses, including some K through 12 costs, let's say private school. Now, the only other thing, the one consideration is a fairly low contribution limit of $2,000 a year. So not as much you can contribute year in and year out, but it could be a piece. And again, there are some income limitations as well for those being able to contribute to the Covered Savings Account. So as an example, it may be that flexibility is the most important in your plan for saving for college. Well, in that case, we may look in your plan and say something like regular investment accounts might make the most sense, or at least provide, be the source of the majority of your college savings funding. Some other type of account, like Covered Savings accounts, might be a smaller portion. College savings plans. Let's talk about college savings plans as another alternative, and really a focus that many people and many of our clients use regularly. So 529 college savings plans, you probably heard of them. Many of you use them, of course. save for your kids' and grandkids' educations, maybe even your own. But it's a tax advantage plan and was designed, of course, to encourage savings for future education costs. They're sponsored by states, so there's a state-based plan. Doesn't mean that you are only able to contribute to a 529 plan from your resident state. You can contribute to any 529 plan across any state. We'll talk about some advantages or disadvantages for doing that in a minute, but it's flexible as far as how you're contributing. Now, really, there are two types. One is the education savings plan under 529 plans. That's one you're probably most familiar with. You're contributing dollars. Those dollars are invested. They can build up in a portfolio, and then you can draw from those accounts to actually pay for school at the time that the student is going to be going to college. The other type, in Michigan, here in Michigan, as an example, the MESP, Michigan Education Savings Plan, is a great example of that. The other would be a prepaid tuition plan. Now, again, in Michigan, the Michigan Education Trust, the MET, is that example. And what you're doing there is you're actually buying future college credits with today's dollars. So there's an inherent built-in growth factor of inflation that you're essentially getting by purchasing through either a lump sum or a monthly annual contribution approach. And you're buying a certain number of credits that can be applied to schools across the particular state or even out of state. Sounds like a great idea, and it can be effective in certain cases, but some things to be aware of: the flexibility. So again, you're not really in control of investment dollars. You're not saving and building up, an asset, an account that can be used later. You're buying future credits that can be used to school. So there are different types of costs that you can, or credit costs that are applicable to different types of schools in the state. And it can be done based on an average cost. Now, what happens if you were to go out of state? Well, the same dollar credit value, it's not equal. It's not apples to apples. If you had purchased a certain number, let's say 2 full years worth of credits, at a university, 4-year university level here, whether it's a Michigan State, Western, name the school here in Michigan, but you picked a tuition plan and number of credits that are applicable to those schools. If you were to then say, well, I'm going to take those credits and apply them to an out-of-state school, you may not get the same value as you would in state. So really, it's an advantage if you really know and are very comfortable and confident of where the student's going to be going to school. That's where prepaid tuition plans work. And if you don't use those dollars, the return of money isn't always the most advantageous. It's kind of a formula average cost based on the different in-state schools, not necessarily the highest, cost per credit school. So there may be giving some upside up by not using those plan dollars. So you really some considerations there, not quite as flexible, but they have their use and are very effective. Again, if you have a great idea of where and what types of schools within the state that your son or daughter or grandchild may be going to. But let's concentrate here on the education savings plans, because that's where most people are likely to be contributing, saving, and we'll talk about some advantages to those. So 529 savings plan basics. I know there's a lot here. So what happens? An owner that sets up the account controls the account. The owner is in control. The beneficiary is the student for whom those dollars are for. And again, those can be transferred. You can transfer to other beneficiaries, change between students. You can even actually name yourself as a beneficiary potentially. You're contributing with after-tax dollars, so you're not getting a deduction from a federal tax perspective on your contributions. You are investing after tax, and you're typically investing from a selection of portfolio funds. Some are designed a portfolio that is the right mix of investments based on the student's age. The longer they have to going to school, so the younger the child, maybe the more growth oriented the investment, whereas the older the child, the closer to that starting year of college, the more conservative that portfolio is. And those can be oftentimes pretty effective. Again, it provides that tax deferred growth, and over time, those earnings that build up are tax free when you withdraw them if they're used for qualified educational expenses. And we'll talk about what some of those expenses will look like, and even some very, very recent changes that expand qualified expenses. Now, many states I mentioned offer some advantages. While there's no federal tax advantages to making a contribution, oftentimes states will offer some state tax, income tax deductions. Michigan is one of those states. And contributions can be deductible against your state income taxes up to a certain amount of annual limits. So, for example, for someone filing as a single, up to $5,000 is deductible, and for those that are married filing jointly, for example, up to $10,000 of those would be deductible against income for state tax purposes. So, again, a little bit of a tax benefit, it can add up to, given the tax rate in Michigan, somewhere up to a few $100s a year. Now, qualified education expenses for 529 plans. How can they be used? What can you use them for? So clearly, tuition at any accredited university, college, trade school, graduate school, professional schools, both in the U.S., as well as many, many schools that are accredited and exist outside of the U.S. There are ways to look those up. Sometimes the 529 plan sponsors will have those lists. They can also be Department of Education has those lists of what schools are available, particularly outside the United States. Room and board expenses, so besides just tuitions or room and board costs, you can use and pay for those through with 529 plan. Fees, books, supplies, other equipment needed for enrollment or required for attendance. Things like computers, software, and even internet fees to be able to do the work that students do now and in school can be used or paid for through 529. K through 12 tuition expenses at public, private, or religious schools can be used. Now, it used to be a limit of $10,000 a year. Now it's up to $20,000. The recent tax legislation of the big beautiful bill that passed at the beginning of July, went into effect, made this change and actually increased the amount that can be used for K through 12. So a little bit more of an expanded amount that can be used there. 529s can also be used in limited circumstances for student loan repayment. Again, recent change. That lifetime limit per beneficiary or per individual used to be $10,000. It's now $25,000. Again, that's lifetime. That's not annual. It's the total amount that can be used for a particular beneficiary's student loans. And now, again, some additional uses, certain testing fees, for AP course tests, SAT, ACT, graduate school exams, you can use the 529 plan, as well as several post-secondary school credentialing. So types of credentialing for different career paths. You can actually use 529 savings plans. So expands the use of these where parents that may, or grandparents that may be concerned, well, what happens if I overfund it? We'll talk about that, more things you can do if you do overfund it. Or let's say you plan great savings, you accumulate, and your student actually gets much more merit scholarships or financial aid awards than you expect. And you may not need all the dollars in the plan. Again, these are some other ways that the plan can be used that's qualified, that allows those tax benefits. Now, recognize that some of the benefits of using 529 plans with making withdrawals for the K through 12. So that education, not all states allow tax-free or penalty-free withdrawals. They're not considered qualified expenses. As of 2025 right now, Michigan is still a state that has not fully adopted that. So there may be some state tax implications on those withdrawals, even though there should not be federal tax implications if you use $529 for education, K through 12 education. Now, what happens if you use 529 plans for something that's not qualified expense? Well, much like IRAs have tax penalties, 529s do as well. So if not used for qualified expenses, the earnings that were growing tax deferred, potentially tax free, those earnings are subject to income taxes and potential 10% penalty. So again, there's a little bit of a downside for using 529 plans for non-qualified education expenses. But as you can see, the benefits are also pretty significant, and there's a growing number of qualified expenses that are available. So how about gifting? I mentioned the power of gifting and where gifting can come into play for parents and grandparents. 529 plans, college savings plans, can be a great way for parent-owned plans for other members of the family to make contributions. You think of, maybe a young child, a family that has a newborn, or young kids going through elementary school, and at birthdays or special events, family members say, "Oh, I'd love to contribute to their education fund. How can I do that?" 529 plans can be a great way to do it. There's sometimes even little certificates that you can give out, and people can make direct deposits for the beneficiary, for the student. In addition, grandparent-owned 529 plans, so or non-parent owned, mentioned before, can be an advantage where, if, let's say, grandparents or the other family members or folks that want to open up a non-parent owned 529 for the student, they want to maintain control. They want to maintain the ownership of the dollars and the assets, but they want to make sure it can go to the student as they choose. So they can open up, and let's say, a plan that's owned, and values that are withdrawn for the student's benefit. Let's say once the student reaches college, grandparent can then say, "Oh, I'd like to make a direct payment to the school for a portion or let's say all of the tuition for this semester." And we help clients do that on a regular basis, making those direct contributions for the college costs. They're no longer accounted in the FAFSA. So there's no impact right from the start with financial aid. Now, it's important to note that for different colleges and universities that may be using the CSS profile, that other one besides the FAFSA, I said it's an expanded application. They look at more assets, they consider more things. They may still count grandparent contributions or distributions as an income to the student. So it's important to understand that if you're using the CSS, or the school will be using CSS. Now, contributions to 529 plans as an estate planning tool is another way for more advanced family gifting, where families are looking at that annual tax exclusion, that gift exclusion, which this year is up to $19,000 per person. You can certainly gift up to $19,000 to a 529 plan. And there's also a limit where you can spread out, you can lump sum up to 5 years worth of those 19,000 annual exclusion amounts, but make the gift in 1 year. So for example, you could lump sum up to 95,000 in this year, and then use the 5-year election that you're saying, yes, for Susie Smith, the student, I'm making that gift for Susie, and it's going to be 19,000 for the next 5 years, but I'm just doing it all in 1 year, 95,000. So for families that are looking to make an impact, to give and have more higher end dollar values for family gifting, 529 plans do offer an opportunity for that, and allow more dollars to continue to grow and compound over time for the family and student. Now, question is, what if you've used the qualified dollars, paid for school, or there were scholarships, there's money left over in the 529 plan? What can you do with that? Well, we talked about some of the other ways that you can, and qualified expenses that you can use, whether it's future credential programs, some of those other costs. You could switch beneficiaries. So 529 plan balances, you could switch to a different family member. And then that second family member could use the rest of those balance of dollars. For yourself, if you are going back to school or want to pursue some kind of education opportunity that's qualified for using 529 plans, you can do that. You also have the opportunity through some tax legislation from the Secure Act from a few years ago to be able to roll over portions of a 529 plan to a Roth IRA for the beneficiary. So if a student benefit, the beneficiary of the 529 plan is through school, doesn't need any more dollars, isn't planning to go to grad school, what do you do with those funds? The option is you could roll over and fund a Roth IRA for that beneficiary. Now, there are some specific rules and limitations. There's a lifetime maximum of $35,000. And there's also some other specific rules, such as the beneficiary would have to have qualifying income to contribute to a Roth IRA. You do have to have qualified earned income, like working income, for example, or self-employment income. And the beneficiary, the person getting those dollars in there, would have to have that income. And it uses the contribution amount, that annual maximum contribution amount. This year, $7,000 for folks under age 50. But it's an option, and it's an interesting way to then be able to not just pay for school, but really to jumpstart a beneficiary's retirement savings when they finish school. So gives a little bit of flexibility there. And then besides 529 plans and using college plans, what are some other ways that you can support family? Other types of gifting. And again, part of that estate planning is, how do I give without having to go over concerns of the annual gifting amount or the lifetime family gift exemption? Well, there's unlimited gift tax exclusion for payments made directly to educational institutions and also for medical expenses, by the way, but we're focused on education here. So you could actually pay out of pocket, write a check directly to school to pay for those qualified costs of tuition, and those dollars would not count against that annual exclusion amount. So again, for estate planning purposes, it can be a great way to give and make an impact, on the family. So when we think about what are these strategies, 529 plans, college-specific plans can be very valuable, knowing that they can be used for school. Now, if they're overfunded or if there's a concern about your son, daughter, grandchild maybe not going to school or not needing as much funds from a college plan, that's where we really want to be tactical with recommending and working with clients on a plan that might use a combination of savings tools. I said before, maybe part of the flexibility is a priority versus the tax benefits of specifically funding everything through a college savings plan like a 529. So it could be a combination of regular investments, maybe a small portion to a college savings plan. And then it could be funding out of pocket to make up the difference when the student reaches college age. So it's not one size fits all. Every situation is a little bit different, and priorities for future savings is important. But overall, to kind of bring everything together of what we talked about, because I know we covered a lot, developing an overall family plan that isn't just where do we save for college, it isn't just how do we go through the application process, but it brings everything together. So college selection, make it more of a business decision. You look at the return on investment. Think about what the gains, the goals and objectives, what's most important for your student, what's his or her priorities. Make sure that the school is teaching for your student success. Is that right fit there? Are the resources there? Is the right academic environment, the campus environment right? Look at the different programs that are available. Understand too that big brands select schools. Some schools will tend to be very, very selective because they're in very high demand. The number of applications that come in just make it more difficult just by the numbers. So can you be tactical and find the right schools that might be more of a fit where your student could stand out, not just for admissions, but potentially for need or non-need based aid. Have a 4-year plan overall to pay for college and figure out the budget. It's not just for 1 year or 2 year, but what does that look like over the course of 4 years? And it could make sense where you just like a retirement income plan. Over the course of 4 years, it could mean funding and paying for school from different saving sources. It could mean partially from cash flow 1 year and from some savings plans in another year. but having that overall plan of what that's going to look like is so critical as you develop your strategy to put your kids or help the grandkids or other family members through school. And then the key is defining expectations for everybody that's paying, anybody that's involved, whether it's students taking on a certain amount of student loans versus parents taking on student loans, paying for part of living expenses versus paying for the entire amount. Have that plan and define that ahead of time. Start talking about that as you're doing the college searching, because it all becomes part of your overall funding strategy. And again, it's never too early to start thinking about this planning and start putting the pieces together. The earlier you start, the more opportunities and more choices you may have, and of course the ability to keep building up savings and letting those compound for you. So I hope this was helpful just to kind of give you a sense of the trends today. What are some of the most important parts of college funding, and some particular strategies to be thinking through as you're looking at your searching, your saving, your building funds, and also things like navigating the financial aid process as we kind of go into the school year and hopefully hit the ground running. So with that, I want to thank everybody for attending this evening, making the investment in time to get your plan in order. Any questions, again, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Contact your individual planner as a client of the center. Certainly, you can contact me personally. My email is right there, bob.ingram@centerfinplan.com. If you're new to the center and want to have a conversation, we're very happy to offer a complimentary 30 to 60 minute, fee waived consultation. Doesn't cost anything. Happy to give a half hour to an hour of our time to answer your questions, to talk about your individual college planning goals, or to see where your college planning questions and needs fit into your overall plan and the other goals that you have for yourself. Other resources, our Money Centered blog at centerfinplan.com. We also have newsletters, not just showcasing some of our blogs, written content, schedule events, other webinars like this that'll be coming up, and more. So if you're not subscribed, go to centerfinplan.com, go to contact, and actually become subscribe and get that content. Some outside resources we have available in some of our blogs and things. We'll reference those. Besides, smart college savings, the College Board. We also have worked over the years with some other outside firms that kind of do a real detailed consultative approach to that smart college search, to that targeting, and have been very helpful with clients over the years. And a great example of that is a company called College Inside Track. Heidi King is one of our main contacts there, hking@collegeinsidetrack.com. That's something if you're interested at all in taking a deeper dive into the strategies to find the right college fit and some of those things that we talked about today. She can also be a great resource as well. So again, with that, I want to thank you again for your time today, and look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. Have a great rest of your evening and a great rest of the year.